Welcome, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the music while we were waiting. So welcome to Lowe Connects, La Noche de Cultura, or the Night of Culture. I'm Jody Seifer. I'm the Curator of Education at the Lowe Art Museum. And the idea for this program came from students who are part of the Hispanic Heritage Month Committee, the Lambda Theta Alpha Sorority, Inc., and the Alliance of Latin American Students. They're on the call with us tonight, or the meeting, and they will be speaking soon, but I would like to thank the students who brought this idea to us and who worked with us to curate the selection of images from the Lowe's collection that will be presented tonight. Especially, you see their names on the screen. Jarelis Cabrera, a senior and chapter president of Lambda Theta Latin Sorority, Inc. Emely Cucunuba Ramirez, a junior and president of the Alliance of Latin American Students, and the two co-chairs of the Hispanic Heritage Month Committee, Josvianny Rosa Alvarado, a junior, and Annette Rizo, a junior as well. I would also like to give my deep gratitude and thanks to Dr. Nathan Timpano, Associate Professor, Director of Graduate Studies, and the Head of Art History, Art and Art History, and Dr. Tracy Devine Guzmán, Associate Professor, the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures Program in Latin American Studies. Thank you to everyone for generously agreeing to present, talk, co-moderate tonight's Lowe Connects. And I would also like to thank the Lowe staff that works tirelessly behind the scenes to make these events happen, but especially Yina Bellarizo, Emily Loudermilk, Bridget O'Brien, Mark Osterman, Christina Larson, Amanda Belli, and of course the Lowe's Director and Chief Curator, Dr. Jill Dupy. Just a quick reminder to let you know that we will be asking you to complete a survey at the end of this program, but for those of you that might have to log off early, you can access the survey, bring it up now and have it ready to go. You can either hold your phone up to the QR code on the left, or you can access the link, which we will put in the chat in a moment. And also save the date. We will continue our Hispanic Heritage Month focus at our next Lowe Connects, which is Thursday, October 8th, with The Trail of a Lifetime, the work of Carlos Alfonso, which is being presented by Sergio Cernuda, the director of L&S Gallery. So please join us for that and save the date. For this Lowe Connects, as always, we ask that you please keep your microphones on mute. And we are also recording, as you probably were alerted to when you signed on. So if you want to shut your video off, you can, but we did call this program Lowe Connects so that we can all connect. And what's different about tonight is our plan is that we are going to divide into breakout rooms after the presentation by Dr. Timpano and the rest of the speakers that I just announced. You'll be divided into two breakout rooms where the idea is that we can all unmute ourselves after you raise your hand and have a more intimate conversation based on, we want it to be interactive and not just a Q&A. So we hope that you'll stick around for that part, which will be at the end. So we do encourage you though, if you have, we're not going to do a formal Q&A, but if you do have ideas or reactions, you can type them in during the program in the chat, and that'll sort of get us going into the discussions for the breakout room. So you can go to the next one.
All right. Okay.
So I would like to invite Jarelis Cabrera to introduce the idea behind La Noche de Cultura and the Hispanic Scholarship Fund.
I think went to 14%.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Jarelis Cabrera. I'm a senior currently here at the University of Miami. I'm also the chapter president of Lambda Theta Alpha Latin Sorority Incorporated here at the University of Miami. So the idea behind this basically was to bring everyone together for an evening. Can you hear me? Okay. So the idea behind it basically was to bring everyone together for an evening to synergize prominent Latin American works of art paired with engaging and rich discussions about issues or topics basically impacting the Hispanic and Latin American community. Some of the ideas we kind of came up with that was identity, religion, and politics, and we kind of catered and looked for the images over the summer and over the course of planning this to kind of cater to those ideas to bring about conversation about that. With that being said, there is an optional donation if you can by scanning the QR code. Or taking a screenshot of this. There will also be an opportunity at the end, again, where you can see the screen to donate basically $1, $3, $5, or any sort of amount that you can, if you're able to the Hispanic Scholarship Fund, which provides resources and a scholarship to a Latin or Hispanic identifying student.
Great, thank you so much, Jarelis. You can go to the next one, sorry. So if you do access the code, this is what will come up on your screen. It's a PayPal account. So again, we really appreciate it, and we'll show it at the end as well. This is what, we're not taking any donations for the Lowe tonight. We're taking donations for the Hispanic Scholarship Fund. So you can switch to the next one. And then I would just like to, again, I'm keeping my introductions really brief so that we can get to this program and then get to the interactive discussions. Not that both of our distinguished speakers do not have a very long and fabulous resumes to say, but I'm just going to reintroduce Dr. Nathan Timpano, who's the Associate Professor, Director of Graduate Studies, and Head of Art History, Department of Art and Art History at UM. And Dr. Tracy Devine Guzmán, Associate Professor, Department of Modern Languages and Literatures and Program in Latin American Studies at UM as well. So Dr. Timpano, take it away.
So I really want to echo what Jody said earlier, that this program would not have happened if it weren't for the really inquisitive minds of these student curators who came together as a group, approached Jody and the staff at the Lowe Art Museum and said, we really want to do an interesting cultural program that's going to be meaningful to our community at large, as well as students at UM. So I really applaud them for that. I also think that this type of programming is so important because it's showing us how art is immediately engaging with students on our campus, as well as individuals in our larger community that may not understand the original cultural context or even the artistic parameters that created those works of art. So what we're going to be doing with tonight's program is looking at works of art that students were immediately engaging with, works of art that gripped them aesthetically and iconographically. And then we're going to develop a sort of richer art historical discussion looking at artistic biographies and political backgrounds and religious leanings, so on and so forth. So the first category that we want to look at is religion. We're sort of starting with this largest, most nebulous subject area, religion, which encompasses so many religions across the world. And then we're going to work our way through politics and then eventually wind up with identity. That having been said, you're going to see overlap between all of these categorizations. You're going to see how when we talk about religious works of art, identity and politics come into play. And the same is true for the other categories. So the first work of art, I'm really going to invite Jarelis to say something very briefly about this work of art. This was a work that really captivated her. I'm specifically not showing you any of the tombstone information. Some of you are probably familiar with this painting. Others, this is maybe the first time that you're seeing it. So Jarelis, I'm hoping that you can tell all of us out there in the digital world what it was about this physical painting that you saw that really drew you in to the potential meaning that was underlying the aesthetics and the iconography.
Yeah, so two things that basically stood out, obviously is the big central cross, which I think many of us can kind of identify with the Latin and Hispanic community, that Catholicism and religion is a very central part of our identity. And growing up, you kind of always see like Jesus, Mary, or the cross somewhere portrayed like in your household or just, you know, growing up in general. So that was a big thing that really stood out to me, as well as the way that it's painted. It reminded me a lot of how when you go to church, you see the stained glass art. So it kind of like mimicked that too. And that's kind of what really stood out to me.
I think the artist would be extremely pleased to hear you picking up on all of those traits in the painting. What we're going to do, and I maybe should have mentioned this at the start of my spiel, is not identify the artist. We're going to talk about the artist's identity, we're going to talk about religion, and then we're going to reveal who these artists were. And I think that will allow us to really engage with what we see in front of us before getting caught up in what we call the tombstone information, the birth dates, the death dates, the whole kit and caboodle. So here we are looking at an artist from the Dominican Republic who is a female artist who actually suffered a tragic accident and lost one of her arms. And so this then begins to reveal a really sort of interesting concept of religion, you know, what it means to think about mortality when we are placed in that type of situation where we're thinking about whether or not an accident is going to rob our lives. It's also a really sort of fascinating conundrum for a painter, right? Here's an artist who uses her physical hands to create works of art. So it stands to reason then that she's going to be looking towards a sense of religion, I think, in her own life, and then expressing that in her neo-expressionistic canvases. Now, I mentioned that this painting isn't just going to deal with religion, but it's also going to talk about politics and identity. And you can see that this particular crucifixion scene is not placed in the Middle East or in more typical Renaissance paintings in Europe, but rather in this vibrant jungle. And so we start to also see how it's important for this artist from the DR to place this crucifixion in her own country, right? To place it in the jungle of her nation so that she feels the realness of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. And the final thing that I might say, which I think makes this such a unique view of the crucifixion, is that we're seeing it from the back, right? We're not viewing it in the traditional sense. We're not coming before Christ as sort of pilgrims, but rather we're viewing it from the back. And that allows then, as we've previously been talking about, this explosion of color to really become a feast for the eyes. And I really love the fact that Jarelis related the foliage of this jungle to stained glass, right? This sort of all over phenomenological experience that one is meant to feel when you go into a church, and in this instance, a Christian church. All right, so who is the artist? The artist is Ala Balthasar. This is the crucifixion scene. This particular painting was created in 1988. It is a large-scale oil on canvas painting. And so she's also using the scale of the work of art to recall previous crucifixion scenes from the Renaissance, the Baroque era, the Romantic era, all the way through modernism, right? So she's mimicking the size and the feel of an altarpiece, a didactic religious painting, and yet she's also giving it this really personal touch, right? So that we really then can feel this closeness to the body of Christ. So again, a great choice for the students, and particularly for the four curators to select as our first major image that will help us make a transition into religion. All right, the next work of art, we're leaving behind the DR for a moment, and instead we are looking now at a Cuban artist. He may be familiar to some of you. His sort of golden era of art making was in the 60s and the 70s. His artwork was deeply interested in a myriad of themes dealing with the Middle Passage. And if you don't know what that is, it's the story of the Black Atlantic, how Black slave bodies were brought over to the Americas, and the forgotten narratives and the forgotten stories of those Black bodies and those Black voices. He's really interested in the original religious practices and cultural practices of those West African individuals, specifically the Yoruba religion and how that influenced Santeria in Cuba. He's also interested in the ramifications of colonialism and post-colonialism, of what it means to capture the Black body. And I should say that this is an artist who has remained in Cuba and is still working in Cuba today. So when we look at this particular work of art, I think one of the things that we may want to immediately think about, or maybe not immediately think about, or maybe one of the things that immediately popped into your mind, is that it appears to have this sort of folk art aesthetic attached to it, which would suggest that the artist maybe wasn't academically trained, which is not the case, he was. But what's at stake here is to really emulate the style of art that he is seeing in Santeria altarpieces or Yoruba altarpieces, and to try to once again create a secular work of art that references the iconography, the look, the aesthetics of a religious piece, right? So it's teetering on this idea of religiosity, but it's not meant to be didactic. What we have here is a depiction of Yamaya or Jamanja. She takes various names. She was a goddess of sorrow, but also a goddess of water and of all life that came forth from water. In the ancient Yoruba tradition, and then also in Santeria, she married her brother and they had a son. That son eventually rapes her, and she goes up on top of the mountaintop and she cries, and her sorrowful tears create the waters of the earth. She's oftentimes depicted as a mermaid in altar paintings as well. And if you go to Cuba or other parts of the Caribbean where Santeria is practiced, you can often see her as a double-tailed mermaid. She's oftentimes referred to as the mother of dolphins and sea creatures. And so we see her crying here, but we see her adopting a Black body, right? This is not a body that has been made white in the context of colonialism, but rather a body that is being celebrated for her Blackness. And again, the emotion in this painting is very much part and parcel to his political stance as well as his identity. So who was he? Manuel Mandibe. Again, an artist who really wants to use his Black heritage, what it means to be an Afro-Cuban artist, to send an important message to his viewers, right? And that can be a religious message, but it can also be a political message. It can be a message of racism, of atonement. And again, when we talk about atonement, or at least when I mention atonement, I'm not just talking about religious atonement, but also the atonement for past sins, sins of slavery, sins of the Middle Passage, and the real ramifications that we're seeing now in the current Black Lives Matter movement. All right, the next work of art in keeping with this theme of religion is an image that we sort of already saw in the earlier work. We're looking here at Jesus, and this is Jesus wearing the crown of thorns, and you can see that there is so much expression in this particular object. Now, the signature is included in this work of art, so some of you probably are already figuring out that this is a Mexican artist, but we'll still play this guessing game of not knowing who it is until I switch to the next slide. Here's an artist who in the 20s and 30s is a part of the very powerfully popular Mexican muralist movement. And part of that muralist movement was trying to distill this notion of Mexican identity in these large-scale public art projects. So these artists are going to look towards Catholicism as a very real part of Mexican culture and modern Mexican identity, but they're also going to be looking back to indigenous pre-Columbian objects as well as deities. And so in some works by the Mexican muralists, you see an image of Christ, but it's not just an image of Christ. It might also be a stand-in for an Aztec god or a Mayan god. And one of these figures from the pre-Columbian world, who's also seen as a martyr, who also was tortured, and whose self-sacrifice is of liberation to the people. So this particular woodcut is really meant to draw on the heartstrings of the viewer, right? We're really meant to feel Christ's passion here. And again, what's at stake at Mexican muralism, and we'll come back to this notion when we look at some of the other works in politics and identity, is this question of, does this artwork rely too heavily on racial and social and cultural stereotypes that it ends up shooting itself in the foot? Or is the use of these stereotypes profoundly important to convey a message to the masses when all they have is visual information and not literary text to explain the meaning behind these works of art. So of course, this is Jesus, or Jesus, which is the title of this particular print by David Siqueiros, one of the three great Mexican muralists, along with Diego Rivera and Orozco. So we have Orozco, Rivera, and Siqueiros, and the three of them did not always get along, and the three of them did not always see eye to eye. Rivera was a communist and was a leader of the Mexican Communist Party. However, we know that he never read Marx, so we don't know that he really understood communism in its pure sense, but he did sort of grapple with this idea that he was growing up as a Catholic, but then is reading or hearing people say that religion is the opium of the masses, right? And so there's always this conundrum of trying to reconcile one's political or personal identity with the religiosity of these pieces, excuse me. All right. The next work, again, building on this religious theme, we have a pretty, again, typical Eurocentric view of the Virgin and Christ child. But what I really love about this particular image by this Cuban artist is that once again, we are placed in a verdant jungle, right? We are not in a Renaissance scene by Leonardo da Vinci or Raphael. We don't have a idealized Italian landscape out the back of the window in this particular painting, but sorry, in this work of pottery actually. But rather we have this amazing sense of the fecundity and the colors of the tropics that are surrounding the Christ child and the Virgin Mary. And what is at stake here then is taking these Eurocentric tropes and importing them to the Caribbean, removing them from their hegemony or their hierarchy in Europe, and instead bringing them to the quote unquote New World, bringing them to the Americas, and thinking about how religion is always going to serve a much more personal note to individuals who are people of faith and believers. The artist, Rene Guerrero, he was an interesting fellow because unlike most of the other vanguardia artists like Wilfredo Lam or Amelia Pelaez, who left Cuba, he stayed in Cuba after the Cuban Revolution. And he was academically trained. He trained at the Academy in Havana, but he chose to go against his academic training in order to, again, get in touch with the sort of symbolism and the spirit of his people. And again, these are sort of his words, that what he's trying to do is capture a personal quality and a subjective quality in his works, even though he's still building upon traditional art historical themes and tropes, such as the Virgin and Child. Okay. And I believe this is the last image now for our religion category. This is a fascinating canvas. This was created by a Puerto Rican artist. And this particular artist was often called a neo-expressionist. And I want to say something very quickly about his technique because it's not apparent in this digital image, but it's so important in how we read the symbolism and the subjectivity of the piece. The way that he would paint would actually be to paint the canvas and then scrape or remove traces of the pigment or the paint from the surface of the materiality, the surface of the canvas. And so this scraping away of paint is a form of erasure, right? You imagine that if we're drawing or writing a test and then we erase it with an eraser graphite pencil, then we're trying to get rid of the incorrect response on the quiz or the test. By scraping away the paint, he's literally scraping away this memory of the paint that he's placing onto the surface. And these erasures then become these sort of symbolic erasures that take place during colonialism. So what we have here tends to be regarded as a mythological Santeria or Yoruba figure, probably a figure that originates in West African religion and then is brought to the Caribbean, to the islands. And this particular figure we might think about as a sort of Death Eater, right? So there's a sort of Harry Potter reference for all of you. We might also think about it as the Grim Reaper, but that's a little too much tied to Europe. So I don't want you to think about those conventions, or I don't want you to get stuck in that notion, right? Because we're really thinking outside of the box here. This would be a spirit of the dead who's collecting the souls that you see in the bottom of the composition, these floating heads that reference African masks and African bodies, collecting these souls in this giant net and harboring these souls into the underworld or into the afterlife. The fact that these souls are being caught in a fisherman's net is also, I think, going to reinforce just how important the water is, right, to island nations in the Caribbean, right? That they are so much tied not only to the fecundity of their jungle landscape, but how they rely on water for transportation and to provide fish and a mode of transportation, food and transportation. Sorry, I'm sort of repeating myself there. So the piece is untitled, and in this instance, the title doesn't give us any of that deeper meaning, right? So we have to know a little bit about the artist, and we also have to know a little bit about religion and mythology, but then he's also asking us to sort of imagine what sort of mythological stories are being told in the iconography of this painting. So Anado Roche-Rabel, a little known Puerto Rican artist, and this particular canvas also, I would say life size. It's a very large canvas and the figure is about life size. So again, one might imagine that we approach these large scale paintings as though we're approaching Renaissance panel paintings or altarpieces, right? That we're coming before them as secular objects, but we understand that there's a religiosity that is really key to unpacking the meaning in their parts. All right, the next section is politics, and this is great because that means that you don't have to hear me talk for a while, because the first work of art that we're going to be looking at will be a question directed to another student. So Emely, I believe that you are taking this one, is that right? Or is it Josvianny?
It's Josvianny.
Okay. So could you tell the group what it was about this particular image and its indictment of politics, or its supposed indictment of politics, that really drew you into the composition?
I was really attracted to how it looks kind of like the Last Supper in Christianity, that big seat where there's like a lot of people, that big table where there's a lot of people. And yes, and it kind of reminds me, when I look at it, I also see a lot of men, if not only men. And it kind of reflects to a lot of things that does happen in Latin America, to a lot of women that has been historically reinforced by the toxic masculinity and machismo that exists in Latin American culture. And I think I'm just overall very attracted to like how similar it is to, I assume these are men in power, how it looks like the Last Supper. There's literally nothing about, this picture reminds me of that, just different individuals. And it, to me, I correlate it to the power they must think they have, or that at some point they obtained. I'm not sure, but it's just very interesting.
Yeah, no, your observations were spot on and really astute. What we have here is a painting that is all about politics, but it also bridges the former subject matter of religion with politics, I think, in such a seamless way. Again, the iconography of the painting is meant to be a direct reference back, a sort of pastiche or visual allusion to Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, or any Last Supper image that we would see in the Renaissance, the Baroque, or the modern era. Of course, for those of you that are Dan Brown fans, you know that this is not John the Evangelist, but who? Mary Magdalene, right? And that the V shape between the two figures is the chalice because they were lovers and they had a child and blah, blah, blah. The artist over here does include an actual woman, right? So we can debate whether or not there's actually a woman included in Leonardo da Vinci's painting, but there is a woman included in this particular work of art, which is by a Nicaraguan artist. But look at the role of the woman, right? She has a low-cut dress and she's standing behind all of the men gathered around the table. So she is relegated to a secondary citizen, a secondary character, a servant, if you will, of these men. So exactly what you just said. We have, even in these paintings that profess to be political propaganda for a good cause, even though this painting strives to be something that speaks to the masses and the people, we still have that male gaze. We still have this inability to sort of get away from political narratives that focus on male bodies as opposed to female bodies. And you're right, the men around the table were important, or at least they thought themselves to be important. What's fascinating about this particular piece is that it was created in the 90s to talk about a situation that took place in the 20s and the 30s. And so this is an artist who's always interested in looking back, not just to Leonardo da Vinci and his Last Supper, but also into the past politics of his own country, Nicaragua. Okay, so the big reveal. Here we are looking at Armando Morales's The Last Supper of General Sandino. Now that last name Sandino might spark something in many of your imaginations because his last name was used by the Sandinistas of Nicaragua who install a new government in the late 70s, 80s. And so they take his last name as their identity in striving for civil liberties and freedom in Nicaragua. He, however, was a late 19th century, early 20th century guerrilla leader who was fighting for independence, who was fighting for the people, who was fighting for the end of corruption in his country, and was assassinated when he was 41. So this particular painting, created in the 90s, is talking about the turmoils that are still going on in Nicaragua in the 90s, but looking back to a historical figure. Why? Because I suspect the artist, Morales, is wanting to make a political statement about his contemporary moment, but is doing so with a historical figure, right? And it's a way then to talk about the present, but address the past. And there's a similar work of art related to this piece, the next work, The Assassination of the General, which you see here on the right side of the screen, which again, makes the general very much into that Christ-like figure, right? So we talked about the referencing to the Last Supper. Well, the general now becomes a part of martyrdom when he is assassinated. And Morales, the artist, is creating series of his life events, very similar to the way we would encounter the Passions of the Christ or the Stations of the Cross when we go into a Catholic church today. And I think also in terms of martyrdom or assassination, or when we think about art serving a political purpose or even a positive sort of propagandistic purpose, we might relate Morales's works back to Goya's image, and particularly the 3rd of May, a really grim story of when the Napoleonic troops come in and completely annihilate the Spaniards. And we see this Spanish peasant, you know, putting up his arms in disbelief. He says, "I'm unharmed, please don't hurt me," right? I'll go willingly, but we know that he will be assassinated. We know the end that will befall him because of the dirty politics of the French. And I should just say that what happens here is that the crowned prince, the son of Charles, who is the king and is a part of also the Habsburg Empire ruling in Vienna, the prince makes a pact with Napoleon and says, "Sure, I'll let you guys storm in over the border, and then when you depose my father, I'll become king." But Napoleon becomes a turncoat and turns that treaty on its head, and basically then just does away with both the king and the prince. And so Goya's image is all about false prophets and the dirty price of politics. And Morales is also kind of showing us the same thing, right? Make sure you know who you're fighting with and fighting for. Make sure you know whose side of the coin you're with. All right, the next image, we're moving away now from paintings and prints into the medium of photography. Such a striking black and white image. Again, not revealing who the artist is, but you might note that there is a photojournalistic quality about this image. It certainly is a fine art image, but there is something photojournalistic about it. And in fact, the US artist who created this image, who was born in Cuba, was a photojournalist who worked for the Miami Herald for a number of years and was really driven to capture in photographs the plight of Cuban refugees that were coming primarily into Miami and South Florida after the Cuban Revolution and into the 80s, and I believe even the early 90s, but don't quote me on that. So when we look at this particular image, we might not discern it right off the bat, but this is a young Cuban child. We are meant to believe this is a Cuban diaspora child who's been displaced from her homeland. She may be a Peter Pan child, right, who's been displaced from her family or her parents even. And the doll, I think, is so symbolic of a broken childhood or a lost childhood, or what politics can do to rip the body apart, right? Rip children from their families, but also this notion of a broken identity and a broken body. And Tracy, I know we were talking about this image and the sort of symbolism of the doll in the past. So I wonder if you might say a few words about this political moment, or the sort of further symbolism of the doll that we see captured in this photograph.
Well, when I see this image, I can't help but to think of our contemporary situation, especially in South Florida, with children in Homestead having been taken from their families and put in cages by people who, in other circumstances, would have been responsible for caring for those children and making sure that they were protected and well in our country, and certainly right, you know, in our community. Another thing that interests me about this image is the expression of the girl looking up towards presumably an adult who's there in some kind of role of authority, and the skepticism on her face of not knowing what's going to be happening next. And I think it's an apt metaphor for the situation that a lot of children, immigrant children, refugee children have been living, you know, around the world, but here in our own community as well, kind of not knowing what's next for them. And then extrapolating from this very small child into a larger community, thinking about what is on the horizon for DACA kids, who, you know, are also living a very uncertain political moment. So that's what this image evokes for me.
Yeah, and what I always love as a professor is those moments where the students can really teach me something about the image, or where they can relate a work of art to their contemporary moment in time. And I think that is the only way that art history lives, right? And we can maybe rethink of art history not as a dead history, but a living history, right? Always alive in the contemporary moment, because these artists are dealing with their contemporary moments. And what's sad is that we see a recycling or a repeating of historical events. And so for this particular image, and I'm guessing some of you probably already guessed that it is by Albert Coya, who again is a Cuban-born US artist. What's at stake here is to convey the displacement, right? The political ramifications of this image. And, you know, we don't have enough time, and this is sort of a hornet's nest, but I'm just going to throw it out there. This is also an image that deals with racial politics as well. You know, when we talk about politics, we're also talking about race and notions of race and identity. This is a white doll that is being given to this Cuban child. And again, it allows us, I think, to really sort of think about the xenophobia that we are experiencing in this particular country. And yes, that means I am making a political statement now, and I am okay with that. All right, the final image that we'll look at in terms of politics, I think so perfectly conveys how we as humans can be turned into automatons or puppets to the state, right? Here are these male human forms that are being broken apart. They are de-articulated or unarticulated, hinged marionettes that dangle from strings, right? And they look up into what seem to be the heavens, or perhaps these dangling lights, for reassurance, to see their makers, to see who's pulling their strings. And it really, I think, asks us to question, do we have free will? Do we know if we have free will? Do we trust and know that our political leaders are doing the right thing? Or are we really just manipulated puppets that are being told whatever these political leaders think we want to hear? The artist here, Carlos Estevez, who I might remind everyone still has an exhibition that is up and on view digitally at the Lowe Art Museum. For those of you who were able to see this exhibition before COVID hit, you'll know just how rich and texturally appealing and beautiful and tactile, how illustrious the surfaces are to these paintings. And Cities of the Mind is very much, in line with this earlier image that he creates in 2001, where he's really asking us to think about a mechanized world and what it means to sort of be stripped away of our humanity. I can't help but think about Westworld. I don't know how many of you out there have seen that show, but I just went back and rewatched it in the span of recent US political discourses that are taking place. And I just was like, wow, this is like profoundly scary because of how profoundly real all of this sort of seems. And this is this dystopia that's supposed to take place like in 2058. And I can't help but think that Estevez's work is trying to get us to come to the reality that we have to wake up, right? We can't be content to be puppets. We have to question who's pulling our strings, or even say, how can we break those strings, right? Okay, and now the final category, seeing how we're doing with time, I'll maybe speed things up a little bit just so that we have enough time when we go into our breakout rooms to have an ample discussion. All right, Emely, you're going to tell us what it was about this particular print that really drew you into the composition.
Yeah, so I think I saw this image, and what the thought that came to my reflecting identity is how sometimes when you arrive in America, if you're an immigrant, you kind of feel like you have to like change yourself a little bit. So here we, in my opinion, it's like the same person, but you kind of like, she's a little swished in one part. And when she comes outside, and then when she's inside, where she's kind of like more happy, she's truly herself. But it's like, there's definitely like two identities at war, when like you're outside in the America, we know you have to be a certain way, but then when you're back home, you're kind of like a different, more relaxed kind of way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and what I love about your reading of this piece is that it really, again, builds upon the previous piece by Estevez that we looked at, which suggests that we all wear masks, perhaps, right? When we go out and live our daily lives, that it's our family, it's our close confidants, it's our friends that get to see our true selves, but the world maybe doesn't always get to see our true selves. And, I just have to say, I'm not one of those old stodgy professors that hate social media. I think that it has a place, but in the world of social media today, surface appearance and superficiality and the mask that we sell to the outside world is just so profoundly in your face, right? It's everywhere. And so I love that you're sort of seeing a tendency to strip away that mask and really get into the identity of these figures. So I would love to say that this print was created by a female artist because it comes from a print series known as The Women, but it is a male artist. That having been said, he was a counterpart to the Mexican muralist movement. So I previously introduced Siqueiros to you and the big three, Orozco, Rivera, and Siqueiros, and I talked about the fact that they tended to use racial, ethnic, and religious stereotypes in their muralism as a way to immediately convey an idea to the masses. This particular Mexican artist is actually going to reject their theories, and he is going to return to a pictographic language that is related but not verbatim based on pre-Columbian images that, say, the Olmec people or the people who built Teotihuacan, these prehistoric people that didn't leave a written language but left symbols and pictographs and images. And so again, we can talk about the appropriation, the misuse and the use of appropriation and reappropriation in this image, but the idea was to at least break from the racial stereotypes that he found in a lot of Mexican modernism and instead look back to this pre-Columbian past. So the artist, of course, Rufino Tamayo, again, was not a fan of Diego at all. The two were constantly sort of sparring with one another. And Tamayo, I think, is one of these really interesting cosmopolitan figures who travels the world and basically takes on the mantra that if I'm going to understand the people of the world and our similarities and differences, I have to travel the world and I have to experience them. I can't stay in my bubble. And so he also talked about the fact that even though these are supposed to be based on Mexican pre-Columbian pictographs, that he's trying to develop a universal language that all humans could relate to. Now, that's a lofty modernist goal that we can, talk about in our discussion group. So that's maybe something to keep in mind. Is he successful in creating a cosmopolitan universal language that spans politics, identity groups, cultures, religions, languages, so on and so forth? All right, the next artist, also a Mexican artist, is a really fascinating contemporary figure. Here we have a female artist who is photographing her own body. So, when we move from portraiture to self-portraiture, there's an indictment of the self. There is a vulnerability that these artists then share with us, the viewer, by placing their body as the object as well as the subject of the viewer plane. What we're looking at here is actually a digital photograph of her body. And then there is a raised acetate plate that has these Aztec figures placed on it. So it's a three-dimensional photograph. It's a three-dimensional object. It's somewhere between painting and photographs and sculpture. If you will, it sort of blurs the line in materiality. And what she's talking about is the various layers that construct one's identity, that one can't just be Mexican or female. One can't be maybe Amerindian and not Black, because maybe she's also Afro-Mexican. But if people look at her body, they might dismiss her as white or of Spanish origin, right? And so she's wanting us to say, don't look at my body and see my gender and see my light skin, but see the plethora of all of the things that make up Mexican identity, either in the past or in the present, in the pre-Columbian world, during the reign of colonialism, or in the contemporary world. And again, Tracy, I wonder if you might say something about the potential dangers of taking codices from the past and a language of people who no longer have a voice and placing those on a body sort of out of their original context.
Well, I have something to say about the photograph with Kahlo in it that comes a little bit later, but since we're also talking about Mexico here, I will say that, if you kind of look at the representation of indigeneity in Mexico and other places in the Americas that do have a significant indigenous population in the present, as well as in the past, we really have to be very careful about considering how non-indigenous artists and non-indigenous people in general use that past in the construction of their own identifications in the present. Because certainly, all kinds of people in the present can make legitimate and interesting claims, right, to indigeneity in the past. But the danger comes in divorcing that present from an indigenous present that is not represented in contemporary politics or cultural production with its own voice, rather than being channeled through the art or the political party, depending on what your interest is, of a non-indigenous person or a non-indigenous social organization. And so I think it's just important to be cognizant of that divergence, especially in contemporary Mexico, where indigenous people have a lot to say about the way they've been treated in the past, and certainly the lack of representation in the present.
Yeah, so I think one of the questions that could be raised in the breakout groups is, does this give a voice to indigenous peoples of the contemporary moment, or does it assign them to a silent voice of the past, right? And what is the role of this reappropriation? Now, this particular artist, maybe I'll just reveal her name really quickly and then we'll go back, is Tatiana Parcero. She is a contemporary photographer, but again, a sort of intermedia artist. She wants to also indict the history of colonialism, right? So it's not that she's only sort of turning that critical eye onto the Aztec past and talking about the role of indigenous folklore and mythologies and histories on contemporary Mexico, but she's also calling attention to the mapping of the Americas by the Spaniards in the 1500s, and this notion of owning the land and owning the bodies that they find there, and owning these entities as though they were discovered by Columbus, right? And that they become then the property of the Spanish crown. And so by placing then this colonial map on her back, on again mapping that, layering that map on her body, she's also talking about the fact that she is a part of colonialism, her racial makeup, her identity, but she's also talking about the fact that one can't necessarily divorce colonialism and then the treatment of those indigenous peoples from the contemporary state of Mexican politics either. I know you guys really like this image, but I'm going to skip it just because I know that we're a little short of time and move on to this image instead. Sorry. Okay, the one thing that I'll say about this, there's a spelling error here. This should be Carlos Betancourt, not Carlos. We're going to be looking at another image by Betancourt. And the themes I'm going to be talking about in this image are relevant to this image as well. So I've already revealed that here we have a Puerto Rican artist. Sorry, I let the cat out of the bag. But the fascinating thing about Betancourt is that he was born to Cuban parents who left Cuba, went to Puerto Rico, and he has spent most of his adult artistic career here in Miami in South Florida and has been really instrumental in the South Florida art scene. So here we have, once again, a artist who's using his body as the subject and the object of the photograph. He's marking his body with pictographs and symbols that seem to be related to cartography, but maybe also to an indigenous language that we don't readily understand or are aware of. And then he's also holding these yellow flowers in his hand, right? So immediately we sort of think about nature, we think about tactility, we think about the embodiment of the self in the body, we think about marking the body and what that means versus interior versus exterior. This particular image, the title is really important to its larger meaning as well. Yellow Blossoms by Mendieta Ciba. So Mendieta Ciba is a reference to Ana Mendieta, who was a well-known Cuban artist who was a Peter Pan child sent to Iowa, really suffered from cultural displacement and a sort of crisis of identity because here she is, her and her sister taken away from her parents. She also finds a tragic life story and her life comes to a tragic end, which I won't get into that particular narrative. But what we see Betancourt doing then is paying homage or referencing another great artist of the contemporary scene, and in this instance, a Cuban artist. And the Ciba is a reference to her Ciba fetish, which was a work of art that she created in 1981 here in Miami, and was really talking about how we as humans need to be better connected to our landscape, right? She was all about phenomenology and connecting her body with the landscape. But to then take that back to politics and to religion, we can also think about, well, what was the role that religion played in past religions or past politics? And how have we perhaps gotten away from viewing nature as an awesome, sublime thing that can overwhelm us, and instead seeing it as something that can be drilled and fracked and broken apart and torn apart, right? That we as humans then, in a sort of speciesist way, see ourselves as dominating nature rather than being a part of her great awesomeness. And that interconnectivity with those blossoms and painting his body with those flowers, I think is just so tactile, and it makes us want to feel the power of the nature that surrounds him, just like Ana Mendieta did in her works. So this was the photograph that Tracy was mentioning earlier. So I'll let Tracy say a few words about this image of Frida Kahlo as well.
I'll just comment really quickly how much I love this photograph. And without knowing initially who the artist was, just the image itself makes me wonder about the relationship that the photographer has to the person being photographed as somebody that most of us probably recognize. for her work in self-portraits. I think, I don't know what percentage of her work was a self-portrait, but, Frida Kahlo is well known for producing images of herself. And so I thought that what was really amazing, one of the things that was really amazing about this picture was that in just one image, this artist, who clearly has some intimacy with Kahlo, has created kind of a microcosm of her work, in as much as she's looking at her, she's watching Frida Kahlo look at herself, right, in this mirror. And so I thought that that was very powerful. And also, of course, the incorporation of the hairless dogs, which come from Aztec mythology, and the statue that's sitting on the left-hand side of the photograph, of being a very stylized image that tries to, create this historical narrative and place herself within this historical narrative as a mestiza, partly indigenous Mexican woman who also has European ancestry. And so the stylization of the photograph with her dress, the dogs, the mirror, the way her hair is done, I thought was very, very compelling. But then I started thinking about another reason that I really like this right now is because I can't help but to think, since we're all teaching and studying through Zoom nowadays, and we're all faced with this self-representation through these images that we have on our screens. It's not every day that we get to take a picture of ourselves or get to paint an image of ourselves, but we're constantly now being faced with our own self-representation through this medium that we're using right now. And it's really interesting to me to think about how people do that. Do they put a background behind them that represents something cool, like Nathan has? Do they have, like their kids walking up in the background and like dogs on the couch like I do, because I can't do the background? Or people who have like to choose out to have a blank wall behind them for whatever reason, right? So I think that this image, and I'm so happy that the student curators chose it, is really powerful for the moment that we're living right now, because of the stylized notion that we have here of what it means to try to represent oneself for an audience that may never get to know us, as individuals. And what power do we now have in 2020 that she never probably could have imagined, right? When this photograph was taken in 1944, and how prescient she was about considering about the manipulation of that image and how it could resonate with the person who's looking at it.
Yeah, I think that's such an eloquent explication of the work and its multiple layers. I might just add to that this is also a great image for the #MeToo movement, because we finally have a female photographer photographing a female body. So we now can sort of get away from this notion of the male gaze, or how the male lens is going to objectify or sexualize the female body. And I think, Tracy, the intimacy that you see in this photograph is because it is a female photographer and a very close personal friend of Frida Kahlo. So there's a friendship and then a trust, right, to be vulnerable on the part of the artist. I would also note that most art historians or scholars have noticed that the Aztec, or I should say the pre-Columbian sculpture, we don't actually know if it's Aztecian, is cut in half. And so we're seeing half of that, and we're only seeing then sort of part of Frida Kahlo's personality, not all of her personality. So a reminder that a photograph is not a window into another world. It is a flat two-dimensional object that captures the representation of a person, just like a painting does, right? And so there are truths and there are mistruths in this photograph. And then the final thing that I'll just say that might be of interest to many of you, Frida Kahlo was a really stylish dresser when she was living in New York with her husband, Diego Rivera, and then in Detroit. And it wasn't until she was asked to be photographed by Vogue and wear indigenous clothing that she then began to adopt this sort of Mexican identity. And so it was an identity that was placed on her by outside folks, by Vogue, by her husband, by the design and the art world, who wanted to commodify her and see her as a Mexican little darling. right? And what I find so fascinating is that, yes, she could probably not imagine the strides that have been made for women, and yet would probably, you know, shake her head and say, but we have so far to go, right? There are still so many structures in place that were in place during her lifetime as well. The artist Lola Alvarez Bravo, the last name Bravo should be somewhat familiar to all of you because her ex-husband Manuel Bravo was a famous photographer who worked with Edward Weston and also was known for photographing Frida Kahlo during the 1940s. All right, how are we doing on time? I mean, we're sort of over time. So Jody, what are you thinking? Like continue to talk about works of art or?
Is this the last one? I don't remember.
No, yes, it is the last one.
It is. I think you might as well just. We saw it.
Okay.
Don't
Untitled
deny.
Piece by Wilfredo Lam, a great Cuban vanguardia artist who studied with Picasso in Paris, actually went initially to Spain to serve during the Spanish Civil War, and then was introduced to Picasso in Paris. He was the only individual who Picasso ever acknowledged as a student. Now, a lot of revisionist art historians have said that that's because Wilfredo Lam was this exotic Afro-Chinese Cuban artist, and Picasso loved to collect and commodify interesting, unique, quote unquote, exotic things and people. But we see then Wilfredo Lam going back to Cuba during the Second World War and not really being welcomed back as this great Cuban artist, but as a Cuban who was too European at this point, who had become too Eurocentricized. And in this particular image, he is playing off of a well-known European theme, which is Venus at her toilette. And we could say the same is at play in Lolo Brava's photograph of Frida Kahlo. And I'm showing you Peter Paul Rubens' Venus at her toilette down there as a comparative image. But when the Venus looks into the hand mirror, she doesn't see herself reflected as the rest of the world sees her reflected, but rather she sees the femme cheval, or the horse-headed woman. And it was a trope that Lam developed at this time. I like to think of the femme cheval as his sort of alter ego. Even though it is a female persona, it's sort of his way of talking about his transculturation and his displacement as a Cuban artist who's living in Europe, then coming back to Cuba, then going back to Europe. And for those of you who are familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois's theory of double consciousness, which is understanding one's identity through one's identification with oneself, but then also always viewing oneself through how other people view you. So again, this notion of double consciousness, that's really what's at stake here in Wilfredo Lam's Femme Cheval. This idea that this woman, this Cuban woman who's of the jungle, who looks to be Caucasian, Eurocentric, Hispanic, looks into the mirror, but doesn't see a white woman reflected back. She sees this sort of animalistic beast, which is also tied to Santeria. His godmother was a Santeria priestess. Montonica Wilson was her name. And so, yes, there is one foot in the Euro world, but there's also this really rich and interesting exploration of Afro identity at play in this particular work. Okay, well, we were supposed.
Yeah, I think we still can. If you guys, I think you're all the ones that are still here. So we were only gonna be in the breakout rooms for 10 minutes. So if everyone's still game for that, I'm ready to do it. But I just want to take, before anyone decides, I really want to thank Dr. Timpano and Dr. Devine Guzmán, as well as all the students, the student curators, Jarelis, Josvianny, Emely, and Annette, and all of the committee members for all their participation in this really enriching discussion. And yes, please don't forget to please support the Hispanic Scholarship Fund by scanning the QR code. We are going to, in a second, split you off into breakout rooms, and one room will be moderated by Dr. Timpano, and one discussion room will be moderated by Dr. Devine Guzmán. And you'll be automatically put in there. And if you, they'll just tell you what to do there. And then we'll bring you back to the main room. So make sure you don't hit end meeting. You have to do join the breakout room. And then we'll come back to the main room really quickly just to say thanks and do the survey.
Jody, could I make a suggestion? When I subtract out all of the Lowe staff and the students and Tracy and
You want to just
myself,
do it here?
we're about 30. So yeah, let's just
All
stay
right,
as one
forget
big
it.
group,
We
and
won't
then
break out.
we won't be breaking out, and we won't be wasting time doing that. So we
Break
can just
out.
field questions in the larger group.
Okay, sounds good. So you want to start the discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I've been sort of looking into the chat section, and I really appreciate all of the comments that are saying that it's a great presentation, and I appreciate that feedback immensely. Again, I really want to thank my co-host Tracy and the curators of this presentation this evening, the students. So I wonder if any of you have questions, because again, I'm looking through the chat and I'm not seeing any specific question, although someone, Jarelis, you said very Big Brother related. Yes, that's a good point.
I did write down a lot of people's comments along the way, so I was keeping track of them. But please, if anyone else has something to say. But I just really noticed there was a lot of comparison with the hands in a lot of different works of art, which was so interesting. Beginning with Jarelis, you said you didn't notice, and how many times, first of all, you and Emmy both said, and we looked at these images like 1,000 times, and that every time we looked at them, that they saw something new, which is, you know, really fabulous and a reminder of why we do this. But that she hadn't noticed Christ's hands in Ada Balthazar's piece. And then somebody else commented on the Rocherabelle piece, how the hands are like palm trees. Mm-hmm. And Tatiana's Parcero's hands on her self-portrait are so important to the piece. And Carlos Bentoncourt's hands are so important in his work. And even Frida's hands right here, and just her rings and the placement of her hands are so important. And so I just feel like not just the face and the body, but the hands are so important. And I think about how sort of, and I'm doing it right now as I say it, how we gesture a lot when you talk. Mm-hmm. I don't know if anyone has comments on that.
Well, the hand, I mean, is such a tool of the artist, right? Without their hands, I mean, you can have artists like Chuck Close that are learning to paint with holding paintbrushes in their teeth because they're disabled. But, you know, you think about what is the instrument of the artist. It's his or her hands and their eyes. And then you also then begin to think about the indexicality, meaning the mark making that goes into a work of art. And when you see hands and when you see those marks being applied on the canvas, you don't quite see the indexicality in a photograph the way that you would in other media, but there's a tactility there. There's something that places that as a man-made object, an object that was made with hands, right? And I think these artists are really talking about the tendency and the desire to touch their world and to connect with their world, and how important it is that the landscape and nature becomes a part of that tactile phenomenological experience in their art making and in their art practice.
Yeah, Jarelis, do you want to say what you wrote?
Yeah, kind of relating it more to like the Latin identity and just like the culture. I was just saying in the chat that a lot of us, we gesture or we talk with our hands because that's a form of expression for us. And our culture in general is very, I would say, warm and very welcoming because depending on which country, obviously, we greet each other with a kiss on the cheek. Some cultures greet it with 2, some cultures in Spain, I know they do 3, like with each side. So it's just kind of interesting to see how, I guess, the hands is a form of expression, as well as how it relates kind of to our culture and how we express ourselves and how we express, I guess, love in a way to each other. So.
Or power or a lack of power. I mean, the hand and specifically the fist is a symbol of the BLM movement now, right? And what that conveys. It was a symbol to the Black Panthers, right? And we put our hands over our hearts when we are saying the Pledge of Allegiance. So those mannerisms are so culturally imbued that we know the meaning behind them without really having to think about it, right? Because they're a part of our collective consciousness. But I think you're absolutely right that it's interesting to not think about identity being registered in a face, but in other parts of the body.
Yeah, I just want to say somebody sent me a private message asking if this, kudos to you guys, if this exhibition is on view. So I just wanted to mention, right? I just wanted to mention again how great. These were curated virtually for this event, and only from the Lowe's permanent collection. So all of these works of art, I thought that I had said that in the beginning, but forgive me if I didn't. All of these works are in the Lowe's collection, of course, except for The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci and The Third Man by Goya. But you can view them all on the Lowe's museum search on the e-collection on the Lowe's website. Judy, do you want to say what you wrote? Judy Von Trust-Prado, unmute yourself. Go ahead. You don't know how to? There you go.
Thank you, Jody. So good to see all of you. Thanks for this wonderful presentation, the students especially. I love what you said about the hands and the cultural identity and the religious part and everything else. I'm thinking about the hands. I went back into the images of the back of the body. And it seems to be portraying a lot of the cultural identity too, from the crucifixion to Frida Kahlo's to the other ones that were portrayed. Is there any cultural identity there also? I just was curious about that.
Oh, wow. You know, I would say as an art historical trope, this notion of turning away, never presenting the body frontally, which is a desire to see it as a sexual object or an object of consumption, maybe if we don't want to eroticize these figures, but a turning away from the viewer is a deliberate choice, right? It gives a subjectivity to the objecthood of the body in those images. Yeah, you know, and I hadn't thought about that, but you're absolutely right. Wilfredo Lam's image, the photograph of Kahlo, the Betancourt image, not so much, but and certainly the image of Christ in the crucifixion, this notion of also viewing the world from a different perspective too, I think was really important for a lot of these modernists and these contemporary artists. So, you know, I think that's essentially in a very sort of cursory explanation what's at play, but I'm sure there are deeper cultural things going on as well.
Great. Tracy, did you have any, since we didn't get to do the breakout rooms, any questions that you wanted to pose to everyone?
Well, just to continue with the themes that have been mentioned already, I was just thinking about how this positionality of the body relates differently to these categories that we've set up to organize this discussion, and how central hands are to religion, especially in Catholicism, where you have to use the hands to make the sign of the cross. And the relationship between power, right, and certain kinds of body positions with regard to religion and identity and politics, like the vulnerability of the hands, not only in the Christ figure in the first, you know, image of the crucifixion, but also in the image of the girl holding her doll, right, where her hands are next to the hands of the doll, and the extreme vulnerability of that exposure versus the violence of the image of the assassination of Sandino in the 3 de Mayo, when the hands then become an extension of the arm, right, that's used to take somebody's life. So I just think that the vulnerability of the body with regard to those categories is also very different. And as Nathan, you know, just explained in response to the question about the back, the backing into something is obviously making oneself less vulnerable to it, right? Versus this exposure where you're really disempowered vis-a-vis the spectator. And this image where the Koya image where the girl is embracing her doll versus the image of the second religious image of Imanja at the side of the river, where her hands are entirely hidden, right? Yeah, because she's embracing herself and she's not making herself vulnerable in this, right? She's really, seems to be protecting herself in this moment of sorrow. And so I thought that that's a very interesting comparison with the vulnerability of the hands and the openness of the body and some of the other images that we've seen.
Thank you for that comment. It's really so interesting. Jarelis, do you want to say what you wrote? Sorry, I keep calling on you to say what you typed when you typed it.
Yeah, kind of going back to like how we were talking about a lot of the images were facing the back and kind of like turned away. I thought it was interesting basically to see that, because like breaking down kind of body language in general and not applying it to a culture, when you like, you know, I guess close yourself off or like have your arms you crossed off or your legs faced away, that seems to portray being like a private person, or you're not interested or engaged in what's going on and stuff. Usually open hands and open arms mean, you know, you're willing or, you know, allowing yourself to be vulnerable in a way to the conversation or what's going on. So it's kind of different and interesting to see how it correlates in different cultures. And kind of, I use an example. I know in South Korea, whenever you're drinking with someone that is older than you, they tend to turn away from them, like to the side or something, just as a form of respect to the older person. While in different cultures, like in Latin America, if you know, see your aunt or something and you don't give them a kiss or like, you know, open arms, it's like very disrespectful, and your family will probably call you out on it because that's something you're just supposed to do naturally when you see someone that you know. So.
That's really interesting comment, Jarelis. I have a question for Nathan or for any of the students, actually, with kind of going back to the Frida Kahlo comment I made about the stylization of our Zoom presentations. So especially as somebody who's teaching this semester, and I'm really interested in how students on Zoom either decide to show themselves or decide not to show themselves, or pick a background or have like their family members there or whatever. I'm just really interested in how people are dealing with this issue. Some of it, I guess, is just practicality, like you don't have a choice and that's what you got and that's what you're going to do. But then in other moments, it is very curated, right? So I'm just interested in, since we're talking about, you know, identity in these self-productions and how vulnerable we are, right? Or not, how vulnerable, I guess, we choose to make ourselves in these kinds of images. I'm interested to hear, especially from students, what you think about that and how it's changing your thinking about your professors, like when you see them like on their coffee table with their kids in the background or whatever, or for others as well who have to deal with people in a very intimate space that normally you wouldn't have access to, and all of a sudden, you know, here we are. So I'd love to hear what anybody has to say about that.
I think like for me, when I see that, I feel like the professor, for me, just makes it seem like, oh, like they have a life too. Like, where like obviously they go home and they have kids to take care of, and I feel like especially with the pandemic, like we're all stressing out about something, and it's like you kind of have to understand that your professor also has to stress out about how they are gonna be safe, because they have children at home or they have someone to come home to that they also want to keep safe. So for me, like, I guess he like breaks down the professor a little more for me, and it allows me to kind of like connect a little more, just because like in school I just see the professor, okay, they're giving me a lecture, they're giving me an exam, that's it. But like here it's like you're obviously breaking that boundary because you're seeing some part of their home. Like it allows me to kind of be like, oh, okay, so like they also struggle with things like I do, like they can't pick a background, you know what I mean? Like I understand you now. So it's, yeah, for me, like it helps to do that.
Oh, thank you for that. It's interesting.
Professors are people too, right? It's like US Weekly, celebrities are people too. We get our own section.
Yeah. No.
Emely, did you want to say something about Maribel's comment?
I think it was very, very interesting. I don't know if she's still on the call, but it was a very interesting comment to make. I would have never like seen it that way, but maybe it is why some of us do decide to kind of put a mask on or kind of like seem a little different when we're outside to the world than how we seem when we're at home. Yeah.
Maribel, did you want to say what you wrote or talk about that?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think it's very profound to me as both working in museum environment as well as being an artist, how one still has to cope with being a certain way for corporate versus being yourself with other people of the same identity, and how quickly you will like shed away all of it when you meet people of the same background. And I saw that with the artists that showed here, how much they're trying to either connect to a past identity or come to terms with the fact that they've lost that identity in their upbringing and trying to just come to terms with it. That's about all I have to say. Thank you for the opportunity to speak up, though.
Well, that's great. I think we're approaching 7, so we went way past where we said we were going to, but I just want to give anyone a chance or any last minute, last comments, last remarks, last thoughts.
Just thank you
Actually
to
have to
Nathan
leave.
and everybody for great work. It was really interesting. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think that we're leaving on a really strong note, and what I hope is that this just fosters more conversations for the students in your groups, that this is just a sort of springboard for other things to come, and maybe not just looking at art, but looking at other cultural artifacts that can begin to help us think about how maybe the past and the present aren't so divisible from one another.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank again Dr. Timpano and Dr. Devine Guzmán and Emely and Jarelis and Josvianny and Annette and all the Lowe staff and everyone for staying on for so long after we said we were going to.